Hello everybody, it's Mr. Cork here. We're moving on to lesson 2 to look at what is climate change. There's 4 key objectives here, but for this particular video we're just going to look at the first one, which is to understand the difference between weather and climate. The other objectives we'll look at in the following videos. So the first thing we need to understand before we can move on is what the climate actually is and how it is different from the weather, which is something people often get confused, even in the newspapers. So we need to look at what do we actually mean by climate, these 2 words here. Alright, so if we look at these little diagrams, climate describes the average conditions expected at a place at a given time. Okay, so this is what we would expect to occur. And basically they take weather data over 30 years and we could therefore work out an average. So we can say in Shanghai, in June, it is generally quite wet and it is generally pretty warm. Okay, and that would be the climate, what we would expect. Now, for a given day in June in Shanghai, it might not be raining, it might be very sunny, and it might be even hotter than usual. Okay. Now that would be describing the weather, which is what we are experiencing at a particular time in a particular place. Okay, so the weather is what we get, but the climate is what we expect. So we can represent that on a very simple little graph. On the y-axis we have atmospheric conditions just here, and on the x-axis we have time. So if the weather, which I'm going to draw with this red line here, some days it might be hot, some days it might be cold, then it might get a bit warm again and get cold. It might have a few cold days, then it gets warm again and it gets really cold and it gets super warm, and so on and so on and so on. So the weather day to day, month to month is fluctuating, it's changing. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold, and so on. The climate therefore is the average of all of these different weather conditions a place experiences. So if I take the blue pen and I can draw on the line for the climate here, we can see in general, over time, the climate of this place is, the conditions are changing. In this case, it might be getting warmer. All right. The blue line represents the average of all the different weathers that are experienced over a period of time. And usually, you record the weather over 30 years and take an average of that. And that average is what we would use to describe the climate. So what I've just been through is really well explained in a fantastic video by the National Geographic. So if you go over to Edmodo, you'll find a video in the folder called Weather versus Climate. It's about 2 minutes long. If you just watch that, it will help to clarify all those ideas we've just been through. This picture is showing us that some people are still getting confused between the weather and the climate. We've got the graffiti here that says so much for global warming. And the reason they're saying that is because there is a lot of snow on the ground here, which is obviously very cold, and what they were experiencing is this cold weather occurring at a particular point in time. So they're like, hey, global warming, it can't be real if we've got all this horrible cold weather. And they've just made that mistake of confusing the weather for the climate. Because remember, the weather can be these conditions that occur and change from day to day, but the long-term average is the climate. And what we are currently experiencing, which is what we're going to look at in more detail shortly, is this idea that the world is getting warmer, and that is called global warming, which we're going to look at next. Okay, so now you should have a good idea about the differences between weather or climate, so we can have a go at this short activity. What I would like you to do is read the statements and decide if that statement is referring to the weather or if it is referring to the climate. So if you pause the video now, have a quick go and we'll check the answers in just a moment. Okay, so you'll see I've highlighted the weather in red and the climate in blue. We'll start with the weather, which is the red one. The first statement, everyone agreed that day was just right for a picnic or a swim. That is referring to the weather of a particular day, so absolutely that is the weather. There is a cold front coming in from the west. A cold front is again something to do with the weather, so that is clearly weather. Every winter there was so much more snow than there is now, said the old man. It was piled up to our waist when I was a young boy. Well, I actually think that one is to do with the climate, because he is talking about changes in the long term. We were calling for a hot, hot week, and there will be smog over the city, said the newscaster. It's definitely to do with the weather. A snow advisory was issued for southern Quebec. Well, that's about the weather too, because it's advice about what the weather will be doing in the next week. England has cooler summers and wetter, warm winters. Spring starts much earlier than in most of Canada. That is to do with the climate. Antarctica has been freezing cold even in the summertime for tens of thousands of years. Of course, that's long term, so that is climate. The global warming idea is garbage. It's been a wet, cold summer. That is to do with the weather. The past few years, the swallows have started returning earlier. That is probably to do with the climate, because he's talking about long-term changes that he's experienced. The sun was beating down on the desert landscape. I think this is more to do with the weather, because it's about what was experienced at a particular time. Although you could argue that that is the climate of the desert anyway. The sun would normally be beating down on the desert. So you could have had climate for that too. The sweltering midsummer heat wave went on and on and on. The heat wave is when it's very hot for a long period of time. The person here said, wow, this is really global warming. Well, no, it's not. It's just a thing to do with the weather. Okay, so that's weather. It was much cooler than usual it was much cooler than usual that June in Alberta. So that again is to do with the weather. And there we have it. So now you should have a really good understanding of the first objective, to understand the difference between weather and climate. I want you to make sure that you have got sufficient evidence in your notes to explain those differences, because I'm going to be checking that you guys understand what those differences are.